Good afternoon and welcome to the afternoon panel, which is entitled The Use of Force, A Comparative Perspective. My name is Dr. Jonathan Reinhold and I'm a senior researcher here at the BESA Center for Strategic Studies. We have what I think is an outstanding panel here for you this afternoon. I'm going to introduce each speaker before they speak, and our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Austin Long, who's an Associate Professor of International Security Policy and Strategic Studies at the Saltzman Institute for War and Peace, Columbia University. He obtained a PhD from MIT in 2010. And before that, he worked as an associate for the RAND Corporation, serving in Iraq as an analyst and advisor to the multinational force and the US military. Among other things, he's published several important works. One is Small is Beautiful, the Counterterrorism Option in Afghanistan. Another is The Doctrine of Eternal Recurrence, the US Military and Counterinsurgency Doctrine for RAND. And perhaps most interestingly to this audience, he co-authored an article entitled Osirak Redux, Assessing Israel's Capabilities to Destroy Iranian Nuclear Facilities, in the leading journal International Security in 2007, and I can tell you the short answer in that article was yes, Israel can do it. Anyway, Dr. Long is going to speak to us today about the American use of force after Iraq and Afghanistan. Dr. Long.
First, let me thank the conference organizers, particularly Ephraim and Bar, for having me here. And the title of the talk is Use of Force After Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm happy to talk, if you want to, in Q&A about use of force in those two conflicts and sort of what the United States has done and maybe what it's learned. But I want to focus on sort of a more forward-looking talk about where the United States is now and will be going outside of those countries. So I want to start by drawing an explicit comparison to the last time the United States found itself winding down involvement in a major counterinsurgency campaign during a time of economic crisis. And that, of course, was the end of Vietnam in the 1970s. And from the end of Vietnam, the United States found itself enmeshed in what came to be called the Vietnam Syndrome. This idea that the United States was not effective in the use of force, that the use of force was actually in many ways contradictory to US interests, and therefore there was a period culminating in the late 1970s in which the United States failed to take action on a number of fronts, most notably confronting the Iranian hostage situation, as well as the burning of the US Embassy in Islamabad. So not coincidentally, I think this period that the United States sort of last disengaged from this kind of conflict was at the same time you saw the rise of militant political Islam, and maybe we could talk about that in Q&A. But regardless, I think this time will be different. I realize lots of books have been written with a title similar to that, telling us about why these things won't be different. But I think there's at least three reasons why the United States policy towards the use of force will be different post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan than it was after Vietnam. And the first reason is a difference in how the United States postures its forces, particularly the creation of the All-Volunteer Force. This was a relic or a result of the conflict in Vietnam, which was fought with a conscript army. The conscription of large numbers of young US men to go to that conflict provoked an enormous popular outcry that went away as the draft was wound down. So the emergence of the all-volunteer force and its resilience during these two conflicts, I think, has a lot to do with why the United States will continue to see the use of force as a legitimate and effective tool. The all-volunteer force has been bent, banged up, stretched, whatever other terms you want to use by the two conflicts in Iraq. I know a lot of people in the military. Relatively few have done less than one tour in Iraq or Afghanistan. Some, particularly in the special operations community, are on 6, 7, 8, 9, however many tours they can stand. And yet, for all that, the force is not falling apart. The United States military, after nearly 10 years in Afghanistan and nearly 8, or actually just over 8 in Iraq, is still in much better shape than it was at the end of Vietnam, when killing of officers and drug use were rampant. So I think the all-volunteer force has a lot to do with it. Second, the United States has created a force posture that allows for the global use of force in a way that is both discriminate and discrete. And what do I mean by that? if you look at the way the U.S. forces were organized and equipped after Vietnam, they were really set up for one type of war, and that was confrontation with the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union on the plains of Central Europe. Doing anything else was going to be a big stretch, apart from the potential use of nuclear weapons and a certain amount of air power. So the lack of a tool that was readily usable in a variety of situations, I think, limited how the U.S. saw the use of force. And this sort of culminated in the U.S. inability to rescue the Iranian hostages, which was going to be a demanding mission regardless, but for the U.S. it turned into a debacle. And of course that was explicitly contrasted with the raid at Entebbe by the IDF just some 7 years earlier, which was massively successful. So, there was some good that came out of this as well. It drove the development of two different factors that enable this use of force in a discrete and discriminate way. The first is what's called the revolution in military affairs. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want, but that basically boils down to information technology enabling very sophisticated communications and very accurate targeting with a variety of weapons. So the emergence of this set of technologies, which came out of the Cold War and have really sort of reached their fruition since 2001, has enabled this capability. The second, which was a direct response to some of the issues the United States experienced in the hostage rescue, was to create a very large and very effective special operations community. The first element of which was called Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC. JSOC was actually the organization, one of whose constituents carried out the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. They've been behind a lot of the targeting in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as elsewhere. The creation of JSOC was a direct response to the failure of the hostage rescue. Special Operations Command came a little later and is sort of a larger organization over the top of JSOC. But the point is, combined with this emerging set of technologies in the revolution in military affairs, U.S. Special Operations give the ability to project power that is both discrete and discriminate pretty much anywhere in the world, with some limitations. So I think that's the second reason. Third reason, I think that threat perception is different. If you look at the 1970s, this was the time of détente, the opening to China, et cetera. The threat of communism, which the Vietnam War was in many ways fundamentally about, seemed to be receding, at least until the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I think there's a different perception now. I don't think anyone in the United States believes that the death of Osama bin Laden has brought about the end of the war on terror or the long war, or whatever it is you want to call it. So I think the threat perception is different as well. So rather than a new Vietnam syndrome, I think the United States has actually arrived at a consensus about the use of force, which I'll talk about 4 elements of which I think are important. And this is a position that sort of emerged in the late Bush administration, and there's been remarkable continuity into the Obama administration. That's why I think this is going to be so enduring. When you have a president that runs on a platform of essentially, I'm going to be the anti-Bush, and yet his counterterrorism policies in many ways look remarkably similar, I think this indicates what's going to be a sort of an enduring posture. You have two almost opposite presidents by inclination and ideology, and yet they've come to the same conclusions about the use of force. So what are the elements of this emerging counterterrorism consensus? One is the importance of intelligence collection. I think that may be so obvious as to be almost insulting, but I think, given where the United States had let its intelligence capabilities erode to in the 1990s, it's important to point out how important this intelligence collection is and aggressive efforts to collect intelligence. In particular, if you look at Leon Panetta, who is going to become the U.S. Secretary of Defense, but is currently head of CIA, he was brought in to really sort of clean up the Bush-era abuses. That was almost explicitly his mandate. Sort of fix all of this stuff that went wrong with the agency under Bush, and get things sort of on an even keel. He has, if anything, been more aggressive than his predecessors at pushing both intelligence collection and covert action. And this is someone who, again, by his inclination, is fairly far to the left by United States standards, and yet he's overseen a great expansion, particularly of U.S. intelligence collection in Pakistan. If you look at some of the events lately, the bin Laden killing was enabled by a very robust U.S. intelligence collection posture in Pakistan, including some that is unilateral, as they say in the business, that's done without the knowledge of the Pakistani state or intelligence services. And the Raymond Davis affair, which some of you may have heard about, where a U.S. CIA contractor was arrested after killing 2 Pakistanis is indicative of the scale of this. There were U.S. unilateral officers throughout the country. So this has been a big component of this that is almost universally agreed on. The one thing that has changed is the policy towards interrogation. Rightly or wrongly, the United States has gotten almost entirely out of the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques such as waterboarding. At least according to what's publicly available, such techniques contributed little to the capture of bin Laden. There's some discussion that maybe elements of the chain of evidence that led to him came out of enhanced interrogation, but it seems to be pretty minor. So that's probably the one change since the immediate post-9/11 period is moving away from these enhanced interrogation techniques. The second element is a heavy reliance on liaison with allies for the use of force. And that allies in this sense covers everyone from the sort of nearest and dearest of the United States, the Commonwealth countries, for example, NATO, Israel, Japan, etc., all the way to countries like Yemen, like Djibouti, even according to at least some newspaper reports, Sudan, right? So the problem with this is that you're in many cases getting quite close to some quite nasty regimes. There's no serious complaints in the United States about any of the sort of nearest and dearest alliances, but there is real concern about giving $50 million annually to Saleh in Yemen to build up his counterterrorism forces. And is the United States actually just building up a repressive apparatus for a dictator rather than actually building up the capabilities for real counterterrorism? So the liaison service issue, I think, will continue to be a big part of how the United States does use of force, but it's going to lead to some uncomfortable situations. You already see one in Bahrain, right? The United States continues to support a regime that's been nearly as oppressive of some of its people as regimes like Gaddafi's in Libya or Assad's in Syria. Why? Because we have a base, a major U.S. naval base in Bahrain, and Bahrain has been pretty cooperative in terms of U.S. efforts in the Persian Gulf. So this kind of liaison and reliance on allies is going to be a key component, but a problematic one, I think, going forward. This isn't really a new thing, but I think it's one that's going to be increasingly uncomfortable over the coming years. The third aspect is, what does one do with all this intelligence? Well, a big component of the U.S. counterterrorism posture has been targeted killing. And this has been accomplished in 2 ways, to touch again on the discrete and discriminate use of force. The first is through this revolution in military affairs technology, embodied most particularly in the use of drones, or unmanned aerial vehicles. So you have a variety of unmanned aerial vehicles that both collect intelligence and target with precision-guided weapons. And this is, I think it's widely understood that the United States has done this extensively. In Pakistan, you actually had the head of the Pakistani Air Force admit recently in a closed session of their legislature that in fact they did allow the United States to operate drones from inside Pakistan. So this has been a big component in Pakistan, but it's also been used elsewhere, particularly in Yemen. Yemen in 2002 is where the first one of the armed predators actually scored a kill against a vehicle with 4 al-Qaeda associates in it. So this is going to be a major component, but the other one is the special operations component, which you saw most notably on display in the raid against bin Laden. There's actually remarkably little controversy about either of these techniques in the United States. Some on the left raise questions about the morality, but by and large, the consensus on both left and right is that as long as they're accompanied with these robust intelligence collection efforts, that targeted killing is okay. The exception to this is in the case of U.S. citizens, and this appears, unfortunately, to be an emerging problem in terms of how the United States conducts these operations. So United States citizens under the Constitution are entitled to due process, and these kind of targeted killings in a militarized setting don't allow for that kind of due process. So you have weird anomalies in how U.S. law treats these cases, particularly the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, who's associated with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen. Awlaki is an American citizen, and therefore if you want to monitor his electronic communications, you actually have to get a court's permission, right, through what's called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court system, right? So you have to essentially get a warrant to monitor his communications. According to the current interpretation, however, to kill him, you don't have to do anything at all. You have to just put him on a list that the CIA and Joint Special Operations Command maintain. So you don't need a court's permission to kill him, but you do need a court's permission to monitor him. And I think this is this sort of uncomfortable contradiction in how one treats U.S. citizens is both going to be a problem and is going to be worse in the future. If you look at Faisal Shahzad, who had attempted to bomb Times Square in May 2010, he almost made it out of the country. Suppose he had made it back to the tribal areas of Pakistan. Would he be a legitimate target then? He'd already attempted a terrorist attack in the United States, could presumably be expected to be involved in future terrorist attacks, yet he's still a United States citizen and would therefore be entitled to due process of law. So I think with that exception, though, that targeted killings are going to be a major component of the U.S. apparatus. Finally, the fourth one is covert action. I think there's no better recent example of this than the Stuxnet virus, which was launched presumptively against the Iranian nuclear complex. This was probably a joint Israeli-U.S. endeavor. No one will take credit for it, and rightly so, but certainly to all appearances, that's what it was. And covert action is going to increasingly be a part of the U.S. toolkit on the use of force. The problem with covert action is in most cases there's real limits on what you can expect for it. The trade-off that you have in terms of it being deniable, right? No one has claimed credit, no one can prove definitively who did it, is you're unlikely to have major, lasting, and substantial effects. So the Iranian nuclear program was probably set back a non-trivial amount, but it wasn't destroyed. It probably was not even set back several years. So there's real limits on what covert action can accomplish, even though it's going to be an enduring part of the U.S. toolkit. So I think those four elements are going to really define how the U.S. thinks about the use of force. I want to talk briefly about four, I think, enduring issues or elements that the United States is going to have real trouble with that I haven't touched on. The first is detention. The Obama administration came into office explicitly saying it was going to close the facility at Guantanamo Bay within a year of taking office. That we're now, nearly a year and a half past that deadline, and Guantanamo is still open. And I think that's because the administration has come to realize that the reason it was not kept, the reason it was kept open was not that the Bush administration, particularly the second Bush administration, were a bunch of lunatics who just like denying people civil rights. It's that there was a real question of what to do with people that you can't charge under existing legal statutes, but at the same time, you have no intention of ever letting go. So that's going to be a real problem for the United States going forward. Even if Guantanamo is closed, something similar is going to have to continue to exist. Second, non-self defense or non-self-protection cases for the use of force. I think Libya, the United States has been extraordinarily schizophrenic on, and I think the reason for that is this is not a clear-cut case of self-defense as in this counterterrorism posture that I'm laying out. So any case where the United States cannot clearly tie something to counterterrorism or self-defense, I think its policy on the use of force is going to be extraordinarily schizophrenic. Third, there's not going to be, I think, at least for the next decade, maybe more, and I'm going out on a limb here. Political scientists don't like to make definitive predictions because then people can show how wrong you were. But I'm gonna cross that bridge and say you're not going to see any major U.S. ground troop deployments anywhere in the world. And by major, I mean more than 20,000, more than essentially more than a division sized element anywhere in the world for the next decade plus. So you can forget, I think, barring some utter catastrophe about U.S. imposed or U.S. militarily imposed regime change in places like Iran. The United States is not going to invade anywhere en masse. It'll support uprisings with covert action, with air power, with any number of things, but it's not going to put its skin in the game. And then finally, and I think of most interest to this audience, and it's a problem I've thought about very much in my introduction. As mentioned, I've done work on Israeli capabilities to destroy Iranian nuclear facilities. I've also done work on U.S. capabilities, which are substantially greater, but it's not going to happen. I'm not as certain about this as I am about ground troops, but I think you're not going to see any more preventive military action by the United States. And by preventive, I mean military action taken to sort of nip a problem in the bud before it emerges, rather than preemptive, which is to say a problem already exists and is imminently going to attack you. So I don't think you're going to see U.S. preventive use of force in the case of Iran. And I think that's probably going to be true whoever wins the next U.S. presidential election, even assuming that's not too late. I don't see a change in administration producing this. So the bottom line is the United States has arrived at, I think, a remarkably coherent and consistent across the political spectrum set of policies on the use of force. There's just going to be, as I say, these enduring questions that whoever is in office is going to have to grapple with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Long.